Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. On December 4th, the National Housing Conference hosted its Solutions for Affordable Housing convening at the National Press Club. The event brought together policymakers and affordable housing stakeholders to discuss tangible, impactful, and achievable solutions to address the nation's most critical housing policy challenges. In today's episode, we revisit the panel Heirs Property and the Preservation of Generational Wealth, which explores the historical and systemic barriers that have led to significant disparities in homeownership rates, including issues around appraisal bias, redlining, and heirs property that have led to vulnerabilities in property rights and wealth retention. To view the conversation in its entirety and other panels from this forum, visit nhc.org.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this panel to talk about heirs property issues and generational wealth building. I'm Abby Suarez, Head of Neighborhood Development at JPMorgan Chase. And through that work, I've had the pleasure of advancing policies and philanthropy on how to address heirs property. And so I'm really excited to have a room full of people to talk about this work, since I know the other topic was also very top of mind for everybody on insurance. I'd like to start by welcoming my esteemed panelists, and I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Natasha, let's start with you and we'll work our way in.
Sure. Thank you, Abby. Good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha Moody. I'm a researcher at the Housing Assistance Council. We go by HAC. So when you hear me say HAC, I'm referring to our organization. And we are a national nonprofit that's focused on affordable housing development across rural America. We do that through technical assistance and training. And we have a CDFI in-house that does low interest lending for affordable housing development. We have a policy team that does advocacy for rural needs. And then the research and information team, which is where I'm housed. And I have the privilege to be able to work on heirs property research at the Housing Assistance Council. Thank you.
Reggie O'Shields. I'm Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta. In addition to the things that you'd normally associate with that role, I also oversee our community investment and affordable housing areas. On a personal level, I've been involved with heirs property for about a decade now as a board member of the Georgia Heirs Property Law Center, including serving 3 years as the chair of the board of that organization. So I'm also excited to see such a large crowd here to talk about heirs property. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marla Evans. I lead a community impact team at CNA. Our team focuses on a couple of areas. One is disaster response and resiliency, which is how we first encountered heirs property through our work. We also focus on sustainable communities, the intersection of affordable housing with other elements of the broader community. And most of us talking about people about tourism and our giving programs. We're excited to be here.
I'm Professor Thomas Mitchell, now at Boston College Law School. On the panel, I'm the OG in terms of heirs property. I've been doing research since about 1996, produced, a series of kind of publications on that, but I've also done a fair amount in terms of legal reform and policy. So I'm the principal drafter of an act we'll talk about. Later on, at Boston College, I'm like the founder and the director of something called the Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights. And we're trying to staff up, and thank you to JPMC. We're in the process of hiring a number of people.
Thank you. Let's start with you, Professor Mitchell. As the OG of the group, many of us are new to the topic, but work to address this issue has been going on for decades. So why don't you just give us a little bit of a one-on-one, an overview of the field and sort of the developments and progress it's made in the past couple of decades?
Yeah, so I started in 96. There was work going on in 96, but it was limited to some community-based organizations, a discrete number, some legal aid. It was almost all in the South, and essentially trying to help heirs property owners in a landscape where everything was tilted against them. There was very little scholarship, almost no empirical scholarship, except for one publication that got cited over and over because it was the only one, the Emergency Land Fund, essentially. There was almost no media attention. So back then, an occasional article from some rural county in the South, typically on the back page about a family that just lost their land, like 4 or 5 paragraphs. And then because of the lack of media attention, there was a lack of general awareness. And so that then bled into little interest among elected officials and policymakers. So there was very little happening. If I had been in a room like this in 96 and said, how many of y'all have heard of heirs property? And so if you're not an heirs property owner, how many of you have heard of heirs property? Okay, not in, going back in 96, like almost no hands would have been raised. So we've seen substantial developments, both in terms of the research. I mean, just to give you an idea, I've just found out, I used to know every article, whether it was a legal scholar, anthropologist, rural sociologist, because there wasn't many. So I used to know everything. I just found out in the last month, there's now been 4 or 5 new heirs property articles, including a couple of empirical ones, including a couple from the Urban Institute that other people let me know about. I can't keep track. You have the media. I'll just give you a data point. Starting in, 2018, there started being an uptick. I alone have had, 230 interviews. I basically stopped doing media interviews a year ago because I got other things I got to do in my life. But it shows you the kind of the interest. And then there's been both at the kind of local, state, and a little bit at the federal level, there's been a lot of interest among various elected officials and policymakers on addressing kind of a range of heirs property issues. So in some ways, this is, in a society that we have a lot of challenges, but this is kind of a golden time for trying to address heirs property.
I think that's right. Part of the reason the JP Morgan Chase Policy Center got involved is because it's just a clear system that's broken, that's not working for families. And when people learn about how the system works, they will actually think it's illegal. How can that be a legal thing? So we'll get back to the legal issues. But Natasha, tell us a little bit about the research that's been going on. As Professor Mitchell mentioned, there's been an uptake. People want to understand the size and scope and the impact of heirs property. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks, Abby. So as Professor Mitchell mentioned, there has been quite a bit of research that's been going on for a few decades around heirs property, primarily on the local level, which, I'll get into some of the reasons why that's great in a moment. But particularly at the local level, there's so many folks who really paved the way for heirs property quantitative research. Dr. Bailey and Cassandra Thompson-Gaither, the list is extensive. And a lot of the earlier heirs property work really grew out of the agricultural space. So there's a lot of focus on rural parcels, agricultural parcels, and a mixture of, uses of land that may have tangled title. But in the last 15 years or so, there's been an increase in a focus on residential property. So we saw a lot of increase in residential properties, particularly in urban areas. Pew has an amazing study. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta does studies around this. So there's been an increase in the focus on urban areas and residential properties. And so the ranges of heirs properties in localized regions range from 0.3% of all properties all the way up to 10% of all properties, and in some cases even higher. And so HAC continued to come across this issue in our work. For example, speaking with our partners in home repair and saying, we're not able to provide the needed funding to households because of this title issue. Or in the community development space, there's infrastructure monies, but the land where the infrastructure needs to be built has tangled title and they can't actually complete those needed projects. So we are grateful for the opportunity with Fannie Mae to conduct some quantitative research around heirs property. There's the first, to our knowledge, national scope of the heirs property issue was done by G. Rebecca Dobbs and Cassandra Johnson-Gaither, where they looked at all parcels across the country. And their estimates were around $42 billion tied up in heirs property. And the researchers noted that this is a conservative estimate, which I'll go into some of those as well. But since HAC and Fannie Mae, we work in this residential space, wanting to understand what's the impact on residential properties potentially. So due to some data considerations, the research includes 44 states in the District of Columbia. But even with those 44 states and the data considerations, there's still a very minimum number of $32 billion tied up in it due to title issues. And so the variation in data collection and recordation leads to some considerations which we really like to stress it's a conservative estimate. But the thing that is true about the two national studies is that it really demonstrates that every state is impacted by this and every geography is impacted by this. Rural, urban, suburban, agricultural land, residential land, there's no place that's untouched by heirs property issues. This really is as you're saying, Abby, like a greater systemic issue that's arising from that. So despite I guess in alignment with, even though it's conservative estimates, it just shows it's a nationwide problem. And there's so many communities that are impacted by it. And I think that while the $32 billion in residential properties, $42 billion in all parcels, while it's conservative estimates, it's important in understanding that this is a fluid issue. So we were looking at a point in time. It just takes one moment, unfortunately, for someone to pass away and not have a will or estate plan, or the will is not executed properly and now an heirs property is created. But it can take maybe a minimum of 6 months if it's a lucky case, and all the way to a decade to actually resolve that issue that was created in a moment in time. So that number represents just one point in time conservatively, but those billions will not be reduced. If anything, it may grow as this is a fluid issue.
That's a really good point. I always, when people ask me, what's the estimate, what's the size? I'm like, anybody you know who does not have a will or has a will that equally divides the property between heirs is an heirs property. And let's take a step back, because I realize a lot of you have heard about heirs property, but there might be some that are new to the conversation. And I think as the only lawyer in the panel, Professor Mitchell, do you mind just giving us a quick definition of what heirs property is? I think Natasha already did that in a way, but I just want to underscore it so that people understand how is it created.
Sure. Heirs property is a form of what we call common real property ownership. And under common real property ownership, you have a group of people who own property together. Nobody owns any part of the property. What they own is a fractional interest in the entire property. So to be kind of simplistic, it's kind of like you own shares in Coca-Cola. You don't own a bottling plant in Atlanta. You have a fractional interest in this entity called Coca-Cola. So that's just in terms of labeling it in terms of its category. Heirs property is often formed, as Abby indicated, by folks who don't have an estate plan. And so when they die, the property passes down to, in every state, if you don't have a will or some other estate plan, the state laws of intestate succession, intestacy, define who are your heirs that your assets will pass down to. So initially, heirs property wasn't a recognized legal definition. It was just so common in disadvantaged communities who were disproportionately Black and brown, but not exclusively, that they just started referring to it as heirs because of the law on who were heirs. And so those people become the owners. Oftentimes, they don't have a will, so their children, the property can fragment easily over the course of 1 or 2 generations. It's considered the most unstable form of common real propertyship ownership in the country for a variety of reasons, a variety of laws, whether it's this law of partition we'll talk about in a second, tax foreclosure laws, and it's also a form of ownership because of this problem of if you don't have a will that is then probated or like a transfer on death deed, you have this problem of lacking clear title, which renders the property, it's just going to sap its opportunity to generate wealth, right? You're ineligible for a panoply of governmental programs at the local, county, state, and federal level. You can't use the property as collateral to get a commercial loan. And so it's problematic in a variety of different ways.
Thank you. Maria, let me come to you. Tell us a little bit about Fannie Mae's interest in the issue and the actions you've taken. Obviously, Natasha talked about the research, but I know there's a lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah, and actually that was a perfect segue because that's really how Fannie Mae looks at this issue of heirs properties around housing stability. The more likely a community has a large percentage or concentration of heirs property or tangled titles in it, the less stable the overall community is. And so for us, that's really how we frame the issue. If you think about it in practical, for any families who are entangled in taken title or heirs property, they're not able to access federal disaster relief programs following a natural disaster. They're also not able to participate in local programs, whether it's around weatherization or energy efficiency, because oftentimes clear title is a prerequisite to participate in those programs. Even if you think about just over the last few years when interest rates were really low, they're not able to take advantage of those low interest rates to refinance. And so, because they're not able to participate in traditional housing finance. And so, there are a number of reasons why we're interested in trying to be part of resolving or solving and finding a path forward for families to be able to address these issues. Because, as Natasha mentioned, you're talking about $32 billion in assets that are locked up. And so there's also, too, for all of us, not only looking at equity and stability of communities, but also a business opportunity. And what is that path forward? And so for a variety of reasons, those are why Fannie Mae is interested.
Thank you. Reggie, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta has been at the forefront of trying to address heirs property and tangled title issues. Can you tell us a little bit more about the program and your activity there?
Sure. And our similar to Fannie Mae's, obviously, again, this is wealth that's already there that can't be accessed. It's locked up. So I think it's a natural fit for the financial sector to try to resolve this issue so that equity is usable for the homeowner. Our engagement in this issue really started in March of 2020. I vividly remember that because obviously big things happened in March of 2020. Our last conference at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta was a forum focused on heirs property issues in Georgia. And I remember we were thinking, can we really have this event? What should we do? So we put out all the sanitizers. We started no handshakes and things like that. It was very successful. We took that model and then expanded it in December of 2021. We partnered with the Federal Reserve Banks of Richmond, Atlanta, our colleagues at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas, Pittsburgh, and Boston. So we covered 22 states at that point. And we looked at what are the different initiatives that are where grassroots efforts are going on, nonprofits, public sector entities. How are they engaged and what's the best practices? And we brought those together with funders, and we called it a funders forum to figure out if we could partner those groups together. A lot of good funding came out of that program. A number of large financial institutions made grants after that. Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta. We started our first grant program, Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas. We were very pleased at our results. I know we did a $1 million test grant, and out of that, we cleared $16 million worth of equity. Mm-hmm. So it's a 1 to 16 return. That doesn't include, we did over 500 estate plans with that $1 million through our partners and 4,000 financial literacy participants. So now we're going to go with our second round. We've just announced that, and we're in the process of looking at grants, at least $5 million across the Southeast. We've had great response to that, and we're planning to announce our results in December or January. And we're really excited about the potential results. I did want to, as part of this, we commissioned some research as well. It was a survey. 43% of homeowners in our survey indicated they had no will or estate plan. On the other hand, 90% wanted their heirs to inherit their property and that equity. 1 in 5 homeowners weren't sure if they had clear legal title today. And we tried to ask that in a way that we could tease that out. Unfortunately, it did affect by income. And so 57% of homeowners making $50,000 a year or less had no will or estate plan. And 42% of homeowners making less than $50,000 indicated they did plan to leave their home to multiple heirs without a plan on how those multiple heirs were going to handle the property.
Thank you for that. Professor Mitchell, you talked a little bit about the legal challenges when you define heirs property, but can you go a little bit deeper on that? And then also talk about the policy solution that you're advancing to resolve some of those issues.
There's actually a range of legal problems with heirs property ownership, from ones that make the property inherently unstable and hard to maintain ownership of, ones that make the property kind of a drag on wealth, the clear title problems, and some others. So let me just Let me just give you kind of an overview. So I started work on a law that when I stumbled across it's called this law of partition. So what partition is about is, if you have a group of people who own an asset, you can't lock everybody into the ownership forever. You got to give people the right to exit the ownership structure. And if they can't work out an agreement consensually about how one person will lead the group, then you have this property law that we got from England called partition. So partition basically says, for one of the common owners who wants to exit, they have this right to file. And the remedy, depending on how large the land is either physically dividing the property and giving somebody their piece and they can walk away, or ordering a forced sale with a then distribution of the sales price to the various common owners based on their percentage ownership. If it was a bigger property, because the initial understanding was that this was kind of rural, almost every state in their statute said the physical division should be preferred because that's most consistent with preserving property rights, and the forced sale should be extraordinary. In fact, state court judges starting in the 50s, especially with disadvantaged heirs property owners, kind of flipped the presumption and made the forced sale the default, even when the land easily could have been divided. So not only did you have this land forcibly sold, state courts were being disingenuous and saying that, well, this will maximize wealth. No, it actually didn't maximize wealth because the sales procedure that is used, kind of like a foreclosure sale, is not designed to return a market value price. So the families who often had owned the property for multiple generations lost their property with all their kind of cultural and heritage ties, and then also were stripped of a significant amount of their wealth because often their property was their biggest asset. That's kind of one example. Oftentimes heirs properties are disproportionately the properties that end up being subject to a tax foreclosure. I mentioned these recent studies in the last couple of months. One of them I was just read over this morning, I was just sent the other day, showed that in North Texas and Dallas County and Tarrant County, that half of the property subject to a property tax foreclosure were heirs property. There's another problem in the ownership that in every state, if you own heirs property, you want to do something substantial in terms of developing the property or getting a conservation easement or whatever, yeah, you can do that, provided you get 100% agreement among all of the heirs. And so, imagine how hard it is to get agreement among 4 people. Now imagine heirs property's got 10, 20, 50, 100. It's nearly impossible to get that. So I could go on about other legal problems, but I'll just throw out those 3. With this law of partition, since you asked me to address that, that was a lot of my work, is when I stumbled across this law of partition, it was something that we actually used to not teach in law school. And so when I first stumbled, it was some field research I was doing as my master's. I actually thought the families who were telling me about this were kind of uninformed because I was like, well, law schools don't teach that. And I found out, no, actually they were right. And it just felt like legalized stealing. You would have oftentimes a real estate speculator buying out some distant third cousin who, if the properties in Mississippi, they lived on the west side of Chicago, had never been to Mississippi, didn't know that they had this 1% interest. And then immediately they acquire that 1% interest for a discounted value because the family didn't know how much it was worth. And then immediately file a lawsuit in state court asking the court to order a forced sale of the entire property. And courts were routinely doing that. So I kind of highlighted that in my scholarship and in kind of an article I published in 2000, 2001, developed some ideas for reform. It seemed all pie in the sky until the AP got interested and highlighted it. We're at the National Press Club. And what that led to is I was part of an ABA, American Bar Association task force that proposed to this organization in Chicago that develops model state statutes. It's been around since 1892, the Uniform Law Commission, like the Uniform Commercial Code, anybody that they developed that. We petitioned them to form a drafting committee. We spent 3 years drafting it. I was the principal drafter. And the received wisdom at the time was, that's cute, but no state's going to care. Fast forward today, it's called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. 22 states, the District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands have enacted it into law, and we're this close to having Michigan pass it, hopefully by the end of this month. So that's where we are now, and in the next legislative session in 2025, we already have 5 or 6 states where bills will be dropped on that.
Natasha, tell us a little bit about the intersection of heirs property and how it affects rural communities. You've done a lot of research on this. So tell us a little bit about that intersection.
Thanks, Abby. So, as we discussed earlier, the growth of heirs property work out of the agricultural space. So I think that there was an understanding that this impacts rural communities broadly. And I think where HAC's focus is looking at rural residential properties. So folks who live in rural communities but do not own farmland, they have their generational homes. And so that really came out of our research, was just demonstrating that this impacts rural residential properties. And so one other thing that stood out in the research was that heirs property issues or heirs properties were twice as prevalent in persistent poverty counties. And 80% of persistent poverty counties are rural. And persistent poverty counties, for anyone who may not be familiar, are communities that have a poverty rate of 20% or higher over 3 decades. And so it's clear that from that research and also from a lot of localized research that heirs property issues do not exist in a vacuum. So while there are title issues that need to be addressed, there are other issues surrounding the title issues that need to be addressed where that homeowners face with or without clear title. And so that's something that's present in mind, that while title issues do impact wealth generation and stability for households and communities, as Maria mentioned earlier, it's one of many other issues that need to be addressed. So one of those things is access to financing. There are rural communities that do not have equitable access to financing for home needs with or without clear title. And there's just an additional barrier when there is no clear title, where it's just not possible to actually access any needs. And so CDFIs have been incredible across the board in addressing the needs of communities, but still the funding sources for those CDFIs, if they have the same requirements for title, then folks in those communities won't be able to access that. We had an opportunity to do some qualitative research in collaboration with support with Wells Fargo, and we actually had a great opportunity to work with Auburn University's Rural Studio. I see Rusty here. And one thing that was very clear there was around communities that developed family settlements as a form of resiliency to a system that excluded them otherwise. And that's something that we really appreciated, that learnings from our partnership with Rural Studio, that it's not a situation of like, we didn't have a will or so on and so forth. Legal access is just not available in some rural communities. And so when the pathways towards solution is around education to then clear title, to then access the products or the housing monies that are needed, that will still present a barrier for rural communities that don't have access to attorneys. The most recent data around this, I believe, was that 2% of all attorneys work in rural, and that's not the attorneys you need to clear title, that's all attorneys. And so there are just so many communities where that's not an option. But also, back to the family settlements, this is generational practice. Families that have, in some cases, been on that land since their families were enslaved on that property, were sharecroppers in that property, and have owned it for generations. And so they have developed a way to manage that property within their families, have their family agreements on these settlements, and want to maintain that. And so to now require some form of singular ownership, which in some cases is not even possible when there are 400 people with claim to a property over so many years. There's just not, I yet have not heard, Professor Mitchell, please correct me, but I've not yet heard a proper pathway to resolving that title. But families still need access to safe and stable housing for themselves now and for their future generations. So that's something that we really keep in mind around rural residential heirs property, is the pathway for solutions. What will it look like to be able to support family settlements or communities that do not have access to the legal resolution, legal services? The other thing is what struck me earlier in the second panel this morning was around housing supply. That conversation. So we actually have come across some rural communities where this heirs property issue actually impacts this housing supply issue, where there's absentee ownership. Folks have inherited a home, but they don't live in that community anymore. And they're not able to sell the home because you cannot participate in the market without clear title. And now the individuals or families who are looking to purchase a home, an affordable home, cannot do so because those homes cannot be on the market. It also impacts this supply issue in some of our rural communities where there's low market activity, in part due to these title issues. And the last thing I would just like to know is that rural as a term includes so many varied communities with varied backgrounds and histories. And so as a part of this consideration around heirs property and title issues, it impacts, or how it impacts family wealth and safe and stable, affordable housing. We also want to consider that at least HAC's research and other quantitative research can't adequately show how title issues may present, for example, on tribal lands. Those data do not represent that and the other forms of title issues that may present there. And also situations like contract for deed, which has the same type of barriers to access to the housing finance system, and present quite often in rural communities. So we like to keep in mind as well that rural is not a monolith, and the experiences and the ways that title issues present, whether heirs strictly or other forms of title issues, really vary, and that's important for us to keep in mind for solutions.
Thank you. There's so much to unpack there, from the lack of access to capital to the estate planning gap. I want to remind everybody that in about 10 minutes, I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you want to start thinking about submitting the question, you can scan the QR code or go to bit.ly-FSFAH 2024. Let's think about so you've realized you have a tangled title. Let's hope it's not as complicated as 400 descendants. And now you've resolved your tangled title. So what? What happens next? Reggie, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how do we activate the wealth?
Just to follow up on Natasha's point as well, I think that's a huge issue of lack of legal services in rural communities. I know we've seen that tremendously in Georgia. Georgia has 159 counties, and I'm blanking on, but there are a large number of those counties with no attorney at all. So even if you could pay for it, your access to legal services is very limited, which is where I think it's very important. And we've seen a number of different models on that. Just to digress for a second, in Georgia, it's a dedicated nonprofit law center. We've seen legal services take the lead on this in many states. We've seen volunteer attorneys, although I will say that is a difficult model in terms of training up volunteer attorneys to really be able to do this work effectively. But that's definitely going to be a model, I think, in certain areas. One thing we're doing in Atlanta at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta is focusing on remediation and next step estate planning and tying those two things together. Clear the title, build an estate plan for the future. And then I think, Abby, to your point, it's what comes next. How do we utilize this property effectively? It could be in terms of agriculture. I do think it's great if you can the nonprofits partner with their state and local agriculture departments, because they can be very helpful. We've seen that in Georgia as well. The State Forestry Commission or Director is another resource. I'll shout out the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Network, which is part of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. They help landowners get connected with networks of advice to help them utilize their land for forestry effectively and productively. I think Professor Mitchell mentioned conservation issue. And also, I would say carbon offsets is a new area that's kind of growing, but that's in the very infant stages in terms of the size of the property. How can that be used? And then we've talked about urban areas as well. Oftentimes, those homeowners may need help in terms of weatherization, making the property more green, ramps if they're elderly, things like that, adaptations. And there's a real need for, I think, and the financial sector can play a part in this in coming together and bringing those resources to those homeowners.
I think that's a really important point. Maria, is there another thread you want to pull around the products and the financial solutions and how you guys are thinking about that?
Sure. Yeah, there are a number of things that we're actually looking at. So in April, we held a convening really to showcase the work coming out of the research partnership with HAC. But some of the things that we came away with from that convening is a need to really explore, is there an opportunity around a product solution that would enable owners to clear title and then be able to utilize and be able to access and unlock so many of the things that we already talked about, whether it's access to grant programs that can be used for weatherization or energy efficiency. So that's something that we are exploring. We're also looking at, and that's kind of on the remediation side, but we're also looking at earlier in the process. So what can we do to educate and inform, similar to what you were talking about, Reggie, thinking about the housing journey, that upfront stage as people are preparing to become homeowners and they're going through pre-purchase counseling. Many pre-purchase counseling programs don't include a lot of information around will and estate planning. Is there something more that we can do there as a way to just build awareness? It may not be the right time for them to execute that will, but at least it starts to build that awareness, that education, so that at a later point when it comes up again, maybe doing, post-purchase counseling, that it's not so unfamiliar. So looking at ways that we can increase the education and awareness, particularly of colleagues across the housing industry. So focusing on industry professionals there. And then something else that we're looking at, you mentioned successors and interest, Dr. Mitchell. And so we have, through our policy, with our servicers, some specific policies around what steps to take should someone come forward to express an interest in assuming a mortgage. Is there more that we can do around that successors and interest policy to make it a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more standardized for potential borrowers?
That's great. Talking about the estate planning gap, the lack of attorneys focusing on this issue. We've been at JP Morgan is focused on that. We launched a partnership with Howard University to bridge some of that gap. Professor Mitchell, you've been on this road. You've been working on this for a long time. Tell us a little bit more about that and the work you're doing in Boston.
Yeah, so a couple of things just in terms of this estate planning gap. So there's a variety of studies, but one study I know about by 3 economists showed that for every racial and ethnic group, not surprisingly, those who have more education within that group make estate plans at a higher rate. Okay, that's not earth-shattering. But I'll just give you a couple data points from that study. For the least educated white Americans in that particular study, it was 58% of those white Americans, so these are white Americans without a high school degree, had a will. For African Americans, not surprisingly, the most educated African Americans had wills at the highest rate, and that rate was 32%. So in other words, the highest educated African Americans, there was a 25, 26 point gap between their will making rate and the lowest educated white Americans. So this is not just an issue of desperately poor Black and brown folks. It's amazing to me in like my various talks I've given over the years, including at the American Bar Association. And then I have Black attorneys come up to me afterwards and kind of be like, yeah, we don't have an estate plan, but thank you for the talk, because that was a little bit of a catalyst. Okay, so, you have that problem. We talked about the problem in rural areas in terms of just 2% of lawyers, and not all of those are estate planners, right? But we also have a pipeline problem in terms of estate planning attorneys. Hardly any of them are Black and brown. I'll just give you a data point from the state of Oregon. I had a Black attorney who does estate planning in Oregon, and she shared with me that in the entire state of Oregon, there's only 5 Black attorneys who do any significant estate planning work. And you can pretty much generalize that. This is just not an Oregon problem. So there is some work being done among some leading estate planning organizations to try to create pipelines to increase the supply of Black and brown attorneys. So I'll talk about, since you asked me about, my initiative has one grant we now got from Harvard University. And the grant requires us to work in Boston and Cambridge. But what we're doing is we're partnering with a leading nonprofit housing organization in Boston, the Massachusetts Affordable Homeownership Alliance. Through MAHA, we are going to be giving estate planning courses to mostly first-time home buyers, but also some buyers post-purchase about the importance of having a estate plan so we don't end up with heirs property. We're projecting that somewhere between 1,900 and 2,000 people in the next 2 years, we'll have our first class in January. Then we're working with a statewide organization called CHAPA, and they have a curriculum for first-time home buyers. They hadn't had an estate planning component, so we are now well along our way of developing an estate planning module for that. And then thirdly, pilot basis, of those, say, 2,000 folks who will do our estate planning class, we're going to select each year for the next few years 30 families that don't have an estate plan to do a will. So that's the kind of the idea of the prevention to help preserve ownership. That's kind of a variety of things I think we're doing.
I failed to mention, as we got more engaged in this issue of heirs property at FHLB Atlanta, we did partner with our credit counseling organization, and we require credit counseling as part of getting down payment assistance. And we added a module on estate planning. We're looking now at, similar to Fannie Mae, how can we take that to the next level? But also it depends on the timing and when is the homeowner ready to go forward with that. But at least we give them the education before they purchase the home about estate planning.
Great. So before I open it up, we're in December of 2024. What are you guys looking for in 2025? For example, at JP Morgan Chase, that gap and the fact that if you're doing financial coaching and then you want to do access affordable legal services, it's fragmented. There's not a warm handoff. Those industries don't really talk or communicate. That's really our focus. Like, how do you bring that gap? So for 2025, what do you guys are thinking about on this issue? We'll start with Natasha and work our way in.
Sure, thanks. So I think that we would really love to see a product that's available for current and former heirs property owners, something that there's lending on some form of demonstrated partial interest in a property, because even if someone is in the process of resolving type toll, if they're able to do so and that's the proper choice for their family, we're hearing from some of our attorney partners that can take years. But in the same time, someone needs a new roof or needs plumbing or needs safe and stable housing. So I think that if we could dream for the next year, hoping for a product development and also increase access to federal housing monies. So HUD programs, USDA residential programs, seeing if there can be increased access for heirs property owners and folks with shared interest in a property.
Yeah, I think similarly, and tying this issue to disaster recovery and resiliency, getting prepared. I know in the state of Georgia, shout out to the state government there, they've used a lot of their funding that has come from hurricane recovery to help get prepared for heirs property, resolve heirs property issues to prepare for the next disaster. So I think that, once you clear the title, you have an estate plan. What are the next steps? How do you help those homeowners best use their property and actually make it economically productive?
Yeah, I think that's terrific. That's how we first came to this issue around heirs properties, through disaster. So I agree with you. I think that would be a lot of progress, a good step forward. Additionally, as Natasha was talking about the research that we did together, there are 6 states that we did not include in the data set. And so looking forward to continuing the research that we've already started, figuring out how we can build on that baseline estimate and fill in the gaps for those 6 states.
So at one level, I'm going to think selfishly and small, just in terms of my initiative on land, housing, and property rights. We'll be going from 1.5 FTEs to 7.5 by next summer. And one of the things we're standing up with the support from JPMC is a research arm. So we'll have a 3-person research team, a 3-person policy team. And I just got to think that we could do a lot more good work with that kind of enhanced kind of staff. The other thing I think is just, like I said, literally, if this kind of panel was held back in 96, 90% of y'all wouldn't be here because you would have never heard of heirs property. If somebody had mentioned the term, you would have thought, what are we talking about? Heir rights? Like, what the heck are we talking about? But kind of building that awareness, I'll tell you, just the last several years, kind of stakeholders that have kind of come to the table to support, and I see my friend from the National Association of Realtors, the American Land Title Association, in terms of certain grass tops, including like the ABA, that kind of have filled out our kind of top-down, bottom-up coalitions, which has been Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. This would have been unheard of just a few years ago. So I'm excited about that. I'll tell you, one, it's just kind of interesting. So about 4.5 years ago, I have like tons of families who reach out to me. They think I could be their lawyer and solve their issues. And so one of the folks were out, I thought it said former NFL player. I don't represent individual families, so I kind of looked at it quickly, moved on. But he kept writing me every 3 months after he realized I couldn't be his lawyer. Sometimes he'd hear another state who had passed our model state statute, and he wanted to give me a kudos. I'm like, okay, I got this fan who's a former NFL player. But then last January, he wrote me again, because it was almost every 3 months, and said, listen, hey, congratulations on your groundbreaking article. Where can I buy a copy of it? I'm like, what former NFL player wants to read academic scholar? So I sent him like a free link, and I was like, but who is this guy? Turns out I was slightly wrong. He's a current NFL player. You guys probably haven't heard of him because he's an offensive lineman, but he's 13th year, and Kelvin Beechingham is his name. So he basically wanted to do work. It's led to the Super Bowl is going to be in New Orleans in February. He wants to do this Heirs property event, Super Bowl week. So I'll be going down to New Orleans. I haven't gotten him to get me a seat in the box yet, but JPMC is going to be there. The Louisiana Appleseed is going to be there. And I think that is going to help in terms of some specific states like Louisiana and North Carolina that we have faced major opposition. But I think it'll also help with general awareness.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.